So that's number one. Number two, classroom, which the menu of questions, in fact, describes as the comfort zone, which implies that there is a critical disconnect between the researcher and the object of research that one proposes to focus on. I would ask all the panelists to reflect on this question, particularly in the context of the beheading of Mr. Samuel Paty in France. How far can we describe classroom as a comfort zone? Probably it's no longer a comfort zone, and it leaves scope for self-introspection. Let's turn the focus on ourselves and what do we do in the class. And this is not a solitary example, by the way. In South Asia, you have examples of teachers' hands being chopped off. And I remember the famous German philosopher, mathematical philosopher, who was shot dead inside the class when he was teaching, and the students felt so animated. Probably he was frigate. The third broad theme which comes to my mind is ideological imperatives, which are implicit in the shaping of our classroom practices. So if you collapse all these three broad themes, and I have decided to collapse them into one single broad theme, which is the crisis of democracy. And democracy as understood in the European context, precisely because you know that pedagogy cannot do without democracy, and democracy cannot do without pedagogy. In that vein, we propose to read the importance of pedagogy in the context of worldwide erosion of democratic culture, interethnic conflicts, large-scale genocide, growing intolerance, hate attacks and killings. Xenophobia reflect only the larger melee of this remarkable erosion. The events in France are probably the latest in this long and apparently unending series. Democracy as a pedagogical form is often offered as a panacea. On the other hand, many argue that we have already reached a point where democracy, as it is understood in Europe, stands in an antagonistic relation to the immigrants' right to culture. The golden days of multiculturalism are now over. Europe's complacency with democracy has taken a beating in recent years. While Europe will be the immediate context of discussion, it is important that the panelists take note of the non-European, basically South Asian audience. For reasons of pandemic, we have to restrict our intake of participants to India. We would like our panelists to address at least two of the following questions in their initial remarks of roughly 10 to 15 minutes. Let's not be very strict about the time. We have time. One, what goes wrong with the existing pedagogical forms and the academic establishment of Europe? Like I said, that it leaves scope for self-questioning. Let's turn the focus on ourselves. What are we doing in the class? What goes wrong with how we teach and how we learn? Two, considering that democracy's relation to immigrants, refugees, and minorities in general has become enormously complicated, what bold and new experiments with pedagogical forms do you suggest to address the crisis? So can we think out of the box? How can we get out of this melee? Three, what could be the possible strategies of opening up a dialogue with the academic establishments of Europe, and with what implications for our democratic prospects? How are we going to open dialogue with the powers that be, the establishment of the academic structure? Because you know that I trace a distinct deafness of the establishment to listen to what we say and what we suggest. And 4, does this call for mutual learning from each other's experiences? How does a Europe-South Asia academic platform help facilitate this mutual learning? Do you think that South Asia can offer some lessons to Europe? Or what kind of lessons does Europe offer to South Asia? Exploring the possibilities of setting up and consolidating the kind of platform that IWM and Calcutta Research Group have sought to establish or have established. So I'd request each one of you to restrict yourself at least to a couple of questions in your prefatory remarks. And then we will try to collect some of the responses from the floor. I will get back with those questions to you in the second round. And if time permits, then we will have a wrap up where I will try to offer some comments, but you will say the last word. So I had the pleasure of introducing 3 of our panelists. In fact, they don't need any introduction. We have Ayse Kegler, and please pardon me if I pronounce your names wrongly. She teaches at Vienna University, and she is associated with IWM Vienna. We have Dr. Laura Hammond. She teaches at SOAS, London, and she is also a part of London International Development Center Migration Leadership Team. We have Charles Heller, who works on forensic architecture, which is quite an unconventional theme for me. She is with Goldsmiths, University of London. So these are the 3 panelists. We will follow the sequence in which their names occur in the schedule. We begin with Ayse. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation for this panel. These are very interesting questions, and you have also brought some other questions that we actually got that before, but of course they are very much related to those questions. And if you allow me, I would start with some other points that I thought that I would like to bring up, and then come to those ones in terms of especially the connection with the democracy and then the pedagogical form, and how the immigrants, question of the immigrants and the refugees' right to culture, and then the exclusionary moments of the democracy in Europe. In the limited time given to me, that I would like to follow, pick up the question of the methodology, and partly related to that the ethics, that which we have, which you have also mentioned, and which we have started discussing yesterday. So I would like to take it a little bit further, namely the important point that Paola had yesterday brought up, that a good research in migration and refugee studies requires the researcher to be disloyal, transgressive, and having a kind of a disobedient gaze. I would like to scrutinize further the question of construing such a gaze so that we could address migrants, refugee agency beyond victimhood, but also as political subjects whose contestations and acts could introduce ruptures and cracks into the social, the political, and the boundaries of the public, which are very closely related to the questions of democracy, actually, in terms of the including the including the migrants and the refugees, into the boundaries of the public. And this is very much related with the kind of the location of that gaze is about the kind of the pedagogy that we're talking about. Second, I think I would like to focus on the discontents of researching migrants and refugees with a primary focus on their conditions and states of exceptionality, and relatedly address some of the shortcomings of having them as objects of a scientific domain of knowledge production. And that also goes back to the question of the pedagogy strongly. I think one of the main challenges of research I see is to situate and represent refugee migrant agency, not only beyond victimhood, but also in relation to a dynamic field within which their agencies are produced and reproduced, and the voices, subjectivities, and activism of refugees and migrants are made and unmade. So within this field, within which the boundaries, I think, between different actors, domains, and agendas are increasingly getting blurred. So that is actually, it becomes a kind of a challenge for any kind of a pedagogy for migration and refugee studies. For example, that the digital activism is a good example of such blurring boundaries that we, for example, last week we had Georgie O'Donnell giving a kind of a very interesting talk about that the digital technologies and digital activism also, where the digital technologies have a crucial role in the surveillance and control of forced migrants. They have also become a crucial medium in the process of refugee activism. At one point, refugee-to-refugee forms of local and transnational protection and assistance are facilitated by these technologies, but also the surveillance capitalism is simultaneously acted out through them. So refugee, in short, actually, refugee activism and political agency are very much shaped and embedded in this field within which humanitarianism and securitization and their technologies are entangled. This is a field of state, non-state, and global actors, where the boundaries are very, very strongly are getting blurred, and they're very strongly entangled. And I think that the refugee camps are a good example for this. On the one hand, they are sites of technologies of control, often enmeshed with the claims of care, and they are also, camps are governmentality laboratories, but they are also social and political spaces of refugee activism, challenging their lack of rights and abject conditions. Often this activism takes the form of an engagement in self-governing, self-care, community development with resilient, but also entrepreneurial subjects. So, which in many cases become part of the humanitarian industries with clear features of neoliberal governance. It is striking for me that the concepts that are animated in this field, that one of the questions that we were asked to refer to in the invitation, in this field, to address and capture the refugee agency and activism, or if we look at them, their empowerment, participation, community building, self-care, voice, collaboration, and which are surprisingly very similar to the qualities, terms which we often animate to envisage a desired gaze of a pedagogy of migration and refugee research. So we see that kind of a parallel, a kind of an overlap there. I think the question, and this I think complicates the question of unearthing voices, untold stories, so unearthing the untold stories, exploring the politics of testimonies by the researcher, that the question becomes particularly complicated in such an entangled and power-ridden field, which I think hardly leaves any voices or stories told unmediated. I think the dilemmas of working on the claims of LGBTQ refugees seeking protection in Europe are a good example of the force of canonization of voices and testimonies, life stories within such kind of a field of entangled actors, embedded within striking power asymmetries. I don't know that the situation that much in terms of the research and then the situation in South Asia, but this is a very important aspect, I think, where we could see this entanglement in Europe. One of the questions we are confronted, I think, as a researcher is how to chronicle, sift, situate, and represent refugees' acts of resistance and activism, what some researchers would call autonomous solidarity, which have the potential to inflict cracks into the refugee governance and the scripts of the social and the political in the context of continuous cooptation power of neoliberal governance. And I think the scripts of the social and the political, and that the kind of the problems, that the pedagogical problems we are confronted in relation to that takes us to the questions of the democracy too. And this issue might become, I think, particularly problematic in the light of the growing interest in the life stories, narratives, in the use of medium of art for opening spaces for refugee voices, prioritizing the participatory, collaborative, and the co-production of knowledge in pursuit of a more dialogical mode. There is nothing wrong with that. I think this is very important for us to aspire for a more dialogical mode, but this is what I'm trying to underline, is that there is a kind of a increasing prominence or interest in the kind of you might say that a kind of an ethnographic turn in that kind of an interest in those kind of the voices, and especially taking art as an opening space for those kinds of sites of knowledge production. In trying to draw attention to the inroads of neoliberal configurations of governance into refugee activism and agency, I am definitely not after authenticity. So what I'm saying is not, it is related with the question of the that we should be after the authenticity, and this is not the authentic voices. But I just want to draw attention to the complexities and difficulties of construing and the terms of an unruly and disloyal gaze of forced migration research. This brings me, I think, to the second point, namely the problem of having an approach focused on differences and exceptionality of refugee migrant experience and conditions. Here, it might be useful, I think, to refer to the coloniality of power, namely the fundamental importance of the legitimizing and naturalizing narratives of racialized, culturalized, and gendered differences, hierarchies for the appropriations, dispossessive processes, capital accumulation, and for governance, and for exclusions, for the exclusions of the segments of the population from the kind of the processes which we might see under democratic processes. It might be useful, I think, to note that these narratives of difference could take the form of dehumanization, which is often the case, but also a valorization, so that this dehumanization and the demonization of groups through persecution, displacement, and dispossessions, as well as their revaluation, often with undertones of exotization, and this might actually connect us to the question about the right to culture of the different groups of people. For example, in art and cultural industries, and for they are part of the, I think, same dynamics through which coloniality of power works. And I think this kind of the hierarchized logics of extraction and appropriation to understand that it is very important to pay attention. It is not simply about having a colonial past or not, but that we could see the crystallization of the coloniality of power in the colonial context and with the post-coloniality. I think it is important. So no matter it is a devaluation or a valorization, this focus on difference and exceptionality reduces the complexity of subjectivity, agency, and the experiences of the refugee to selected terrain. So coloniality of power actually works against the kind of understanding the complexity of the agency and the subjectification processes of the refugees and the migrants. I think this is very much a shortcoming of discussing the phenomenon of forced migration along the lines of exceptionality, against which I think Rana Beer aptly warns us. That is to say, discussing it in disconnection to other groups who are also subject to forms of displacements and dispossessions, including the legal dispossessions, which often lead us to disregard refugees, migrants, commonalities with them. So I think the preferred focus on the difference of experiences and conditions is very much related to migration studies having established itself as a specific field of knowledge production. Not only in this field, not only this field has become intricately part of the migration, refugee industries and governance mechanisms, it might also not be the most suitable location for a disloyal, disobedient gaze to see, situate the commoning acts of refugees with others, as well as to capture their emergence as political subjects in solidarity with others. And I think this is very much related with so where do we would like to locate our pedagogy in terms of that there are gays. This, I think, might be an unsuitable location to capture refugees' acts, which might introduce ruptures into the scripts of the society. If we were to displace the topology of migration refugee research and critically rethink its pedagogy. Maybe we should start acting against the institutionalization of this field of academic knowledge production. In that sense, I think the militant research that we were also referred to in the questions still remains as a challenge to all of us. So I will stop now, and maybe we could get into the questions about in terms of the questions posed in the beginning of the session, in terms and what kind of lessons we could take from Europe and then the Asia in terms of in juxtaposition to each other, and what would be the democracy's relation to that kind of a pedagogical form. That is, in a way, I'm just trying to complicate that, the location of that gaze, in a way reproducing those kind of the exclusions, and bringing the exceptionality emphasis, bringing the migrants and refugees more and more into the foreground, detaching their connections with other groups, which also feeds into the kind of the populisms and the authoritarianism that we see in especially, I mean, not only in Europe, but in Europe very clearly. So I will, I think, stop here.
Thank you, Aisha. You covered a lot of ground, and two of the initial takeaways for me are, number one, your concept of field where subjectivity gets produced. And the second is the red flag against valorizing and exoticizing refugee voices. I think very timely ones, and I'm sure that other panelists might sort of pick up issues in respect of these two broad themes. Over to Laura.
Thank you. It's really nice to be invited to address this group. I've wanted to come to Calcutta for a long time to take part in the conference firsthand. So this will have to do for this year, but I hope to come another time in the future. I thought I would take as my starting point a slightly sort of come at the questions that Ranabir set for us in a slightly from a different perspective by discussing with you some of the work that I've been involved with the migration leadership team in the past few years, which was really a process of trying to decenter and decolonialize, in a sense, or the whole kind of research enterprise. So if you think about pedagogy as, you know, what do we teach? How do we approach our thinking about imparting our knowledge? I think that research and the structure of research is a huge part of that. And so I'll explain that in more clearly, hopefully, in a few minutes. I just wanted to share my screen with you in case it's easier to follow along. Of course, now I've got so many things open that it may not work. There we go. So hopefully this will work. And just wanted to, this is just really a few slides, and I'll more speak to them rather than read from them. But just to say that, you know, here in the UK and SOAS in particular, we're kind of leading the way, I would say, probably in terms of the UK higher education institutions at thinking about decolonizing our curriculum. And that has to do with, you know, thinking about what kinds of literature, what kind of texts we're teaching, how are we teaching, what kinds of discussions are we having, what kinds of critical questions are we asking about the histories of our discipline and the current engagements of our discipline, etc. There has not been as much research, I must say, into thinking about how to decolonize the whole research structure of research practice, and that's where I am kind of coming in here. I am going to, so just to kind of describe this process for those of you who may not have heard about it, we were charged a few years ago with coming up with a shared strategy for migration research. And we were asked to do this and commissioned to do this by the two research councils in the UK that were interested really in migration research and how to give it a higher profile, how to identify themes that needed to be looked at. And we thought, okay, we could do that. We could really do that almost as a desk study at identifying the themes that should need to be covered. But shouldn't we also think about this as, you know, the nature of migration studies being deeply rooted in international collaboration with other research communities, but also with this kind of interaction with the so-called other, if you like, migrants and refugees and stateless people, et cetera, and we have a lot of methodological, ethical, pedagogical questions about how that should be best done. And so couldn't we incorporate those into this process, I guess? So we wanted to understand, we also wanted to understand some of the sort of gaps and inequalities that exist and sort of lack of communication that exists even within that interdisciplinary field of migration studies and between migration studies and what we might call forced migration studies. So we're sort of taking on these questions about how does interdisciplinarity work in practice at the heart of our work. We decided that we would do this through a process of co-production, so trying to, as much as possible, decenter even the research process by which we would come up with this shared strategy. So we had a series of, I think we had 11 global migration conversations we had. And the first one actually was held in Delhi, which is where I first met Ranabir Samedar, and sort of saw as well, again, Paula Banerjee, who I knew from many years previously. And we wanted to go to people and say, we have a blank slate. We're not exactly sure how to think about these things. We're not exactly sure what we should say in this strategy document. You tell us what you think. And it was a really useful process. And I'm really glad actually that we started the process in South Asia. It wasn't just an India focused discussion. It was including people from Sri Lanka, from Afghanistan, from Bangladesh, from all around the region, really telling us what kinds of issues they're dealing with, both in terms of kind of regional movement, regional kind of thematic questions, but also the practicalities of what it means to do research and what it means to do international research with researchers based in the UK or based somewhere else as well. And it was a really illuminating experience. We wanted to think about very critically and reflexively about our own position vis-a-vis migration studies and refugee studies and try to understand how to do that in a more sensitive, more kind of, well, yeah, egalitarian, I guess one might say, way that really was more collaborative and took seriously this need to sort of decolonize research structures. My slides are not working here. There we go. We had, as I said, we had this series of different conversations all around the world. We met in South America, South Africa, East Africa, several places in Europe, the US, and really tried to engage with not just researchers, but also with people engaged with policy, with practitioners engaged who are working with migrants, with migrant organizations themselves. Tried as much as possible to get refugee and migrant voices included in these conversations. We also engage with artists and museum curators to try to understand, to try to bring the conversation so that it's not just between ourselves as researchers, but that is a conversation that includes the public and includes different ways of speaking out to and reaching out to different kinds of communities. So those were really important kinds of discussions that were had, and the kinds of questions that we were asking people really were about, yes, we had this question around what are the substantive gaps, but I think really in some ways the more interesting forms of research that we engaged with in this process were about how to strengthen these international and interdisciplinary partnerships for migration research. How can we understand better a structure that has been quite vertical for quite a long time? So the way that UK research funding happens is that usually there's a requirement that the principal investigator must be based at a UK institution. Most of the funds will go through that that so-called PI's institution, and then filter down to co-investigators and researchers in the countries in which the research is carried out. And what that means in practice is that the power that decides what gets researched, how it gets researched, what data gets collected, how it gets analyzed, what gets written, whose name goes on the publications, is all pretty much controlled by the UK-based lead researcher. And that is a structure that is, of course, problematic all the way through. And it was really useful and important to us to talk to people who had been involved in those kind of relationships about what it means to be working in that way, how difficult it is to build your career, to do the kind of research that you want to be able to do when you don't actually have any kind of control over what happens to it. And very often where your own participation and ownership of the work that is rightfully yours is not recognized and not shared publicly. So huge problems inherent in this. And this is why I say that there's a real need to decolonize the research process. And it was very important to kind of gather these stories and accounts from around the globe to try to understand what could be done about it. That's kind of just within the research community in a sense. Then there's also, and this is building on comments that have already been made in this conference, to think about also these inherent power inequalities between those who are doing the research and those who are being researched. And that is something that I think is hopefully, inherent to the migration studies field, that we are troubled by that. We're troubled by our position of being spokespeople for someone else's experience in this way. And I think that there's a lot more that we need to do about how we can work with migrants and refugees in different ways. We're already doing that, I think, as they become researchers themselves, as they become spokespeople themselves who are demanding that their voices be heard. It's about not giving voice to people, but just stepping aside sometimes and allowing those voices to be heard. This is a long process, and I just wanted to kind of focus on some of the clear, kind of most relevant aspects of it for this discussion. But what came out of these kinds of conversations after more than basically 18 months of going around the world talking to different people about their own views on what needs to be done in terms of decolonizing research practice, is a series of recommendations, one of which was really to be much more reflexive about partnerships in general, about the ways in which funding is structured, the ways in which grants and projects are dreamt up in the first place. So that requires the buy-in from funders, but also from people who write grant proposals, to be honest. Many people think that they must write a funding proposal in a certain structure or it won't be funded, which is actually not true. I have another hat on where I work with UK Research and Innovation as what they call a global challenge leader for displacement. And one of the things that I do within that role is to try to push the UK Research and Innovation to be more open to giving funding through different kinds of mechanisms that is not just that same old kind of UK-based PI with a vertical structure. And that's a slow process. It's not just about gathering the political will to be able to do that, because if it was just about that, I think we would have cracked it a long time ago and we would have already be there. But what it's really about also is having in place the kind of administration systems, the financial management systems that can take into account different reporting mechanisms from around the world, that can work very closely with new grantees so that they can understand how best to manage the resources and report on them, which is something that many people don't have a lot of experience with. And why should they? Because they've never been given the opportunity before. So it's a really slow process, but it is changing. And it isn't just about funders changing their position. It's also about researchers changing their own demands of those funders and saying, look, here's a proposal for research that's going to be done in a very different way. Take it as a new and innovative structure, not just in terms of the theme of that's being looked at in the research, but also in terms of the way research is being done. Research councils are really interested in that. And so I would encourage people to do that. we really looked carefully at trying to call for more collaborative agenda setting and research design. So we found that very often people said that they were only brought in at the very end of the design process, even the day before a funding application was made, where so you get a phone call and says, can you send me your CV? The grant proposal is due tomorrow. I'll get back in touch with you if we get the funding. And then you hear from them later on when you're about to start the research. So you have no input into actually how this research gets structured, which is just absolutely got to change. I mentioned already the way that resources are allocated and distributed. We found as well, lots of people saying that international collaborators complaining that they're used as data collectors, as research assistants, not involved very much in data analysis, not involved in actually grant proposal writing, not involved in the actual academic outputs and writing. Which of course provides these limitations for professional development. And there's a really important need for, not for capacity building, but for capacity bridging. Because of course, as well, we find that some of the best researchers in methodological terms tend to be in the countries where the research is being done. And there's a lot of learning that can happen at the top end of this research process as well, or at the UK end in this case. It's really important as well that people spend time and resources building relationships before calls for research grants come out, so that they have networks and they know each other well, and they can already start to put into motion that relationship that's been built up over time. And I hope that the work of the migration leadership team, we now have developed a network of over 450 people, and the intention is very much to keep that network alive, not so much with a strong center based in the UK, but more as a sort of a series of hubs or nodes in which different people throughout the network will communicate with each other, connect with each other horizontally from region to region, rather than going through us in some cases. Really important to make sure, as well as I mentioned before, that there's meaningful engagement with and of migrant communities. And so many different ways of doing that, but one must recognize that sometimes the very language that we use can alienate some of the migrant communities that we claim to be working with. And so we need to be very clear about the language we use, the approaches we use, so that we don't inadvertently isolate or alienate those who we seek to work with. So just kind of give you those were just kind of the highlights of kind of what this process was about. But again, to go back to my first starting point, this is our picture from the Delhi meeting. I'm not sure where Ranabir and Paula were. They seem to have left before we managed to snap the picture. But just to bring it back to the whole question of pedagogy, I'm also a professor, I'm a teacher. And so much of what I teach in the classroom is based on the research that I do. So the more that we get right, this decolonizing of the research process, I think the more we can also take forward this process of decentering and critically interrogating the structures of power that exist within the classroom in terms of the kinds of approaches that we teach, the kinds of research methods that we teach, the kinds of texts that we use. These are the tools that we are giving to the next generation of researchers. And if we are continually presenting them with research to use in their own work that is the product of these unequal relationships and vertical power structures, then we're only ensuring that those kinds of structures will reproduce themselves again. So I hope this has made some sense, and I hope that we can relate it back to some of the really important questions that were set to this panel to consider. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. I think two of the things that should be the main themes of our discussion subsequently. One is the importance of dialogue, networking, and partnership in knowledge production. And number two, and I would request you to reflect more, maybe in the second round, on how you can do away with power asymmetries. And if you could, for example, cite one or two examples from your own experience, that would be very, very much appreciated. So it's over to Charles.
Thanks a lot. Very happy to join you today. And you were asking earlier on what can be the particular lessons from South Asia, and I think very simply the bold and reflexive questions that were raised by yourself and by Ranabir, allowing for this kind of conversation is already really a very, very important contribution. And these are, in fact, rare reflexive reflections that we have in the field of migration, refugee, border studies across Europe, I find. So you were noting before that forensic architecture, and even more specifically the project I lead, forensic oceanography, are maybe slightly new terms for some of us here. And so maybe I'll just start by talking a bit about my own research practice and the forensic architecture and forensic oceanography projects, and hopefully connect these back to some of the questions that were raised in the process. So essentially, I'm a researcher, but also a filmmaker. I've been working on migration, borders, within and at the borders of Europe for the last 15 years or so. I guess very, very broadly, my work is very much influenced by post-structural theory, the work of Foucault, of Deleuze in particular, but also very much by post-colonial theory and, let's say, colonial studies beyond that. And clearly, autonomous Marxism as a particular strand within Marxist thinking, and even more specifically, the autonomy of migration approach, which has been mentioned earlier on today, is clearly a very important approach for me that has really, how should I say, informed the way I look at migration and borders. I think it connects with a lot that Aisha in particular mentions in terms of emphasizing the subjective practices of migrants and the political dimensions of their transgressive movements. But somehow, if you will, the autonomy of migration approach operates a kind of Copernican revolution, so to speak, that autonomous Marxism sought to accomplish in relation to labor in the field of migration, i.e., if autonomous Marxism sought to start from the primacy of worker struggles in shaping the logics and operations of capital, the autonomy of migration starts from the movements, constraints, and struggles of migrants instead of from borders and bordering practices. It makes us, as Sandro Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen have argued, riffing on the title of James Scott's seminal book, it makes us see like migrants. So the autonomy of migration approach has been really extremely important in shaping my own and the collaborative research projects I've taken part in. And then, of course, I should mention the fact that I'm initially trained as an artist and filmmaker. And so let's say the aesthetic dimension of both research and practice, aesthetics as a perspective, as a way of considering conditions of invisibility, inaudibility, various partitions of the sensible, to speak in the terms forged by Jacques Rancière, has certainly very much influenced my own thinking. And some way along my trajectory, I encountered the work of architect and writer Eyal Weizman. Eyal founded the Center for Research Architecture based at Goldsmiths, which essentially took some of the forms of spatial analysis that are central to any architectural practice, but rather than gearing them at constructing buildings or planning cities, really sought to mobilize these tools of spatial analysis as a form of research perspective. And his work on the spatial structure of the Israeli occupation was absolutely fundamental for us. And I have to say, in fact, continues to shape my own thinking in profound ways. Somehow you could think that the analysis of the occupation, of the way borders work in the occupied Palestinian territories, we're trying to kind of scale up almost that analysis and bring it to bear on the Mediterranean frontier as a whole. So Eyal's spatial analysis was absolutely central to my and our own thinking. And around 2009, Eyal, with a group of other scholars, began forging the collective project Forensic Architecture. And essentially that project took as starting point what we saw as an emerging forensic turn in human rights practice, i.e. the shift from a human rights practice based on the testimonies of victims and geared at mobilizing shame, as we call this, to a practice geared based not only on the testimonies of victims, but on the gathering of multiple other sources of evidence, from rubble analysis to satellite imagery to mobile phone recordings and videos, etc., and geared at the legal sphere. And I'd like to stress that forensic architecture emerged as a research project trying to take stock of that shift, and considering that this shift had many potentials to shape new research and activist practices, but also had many issues and ambivalences that demanded to be reflected upon. So really the idea here was that not that of, how should I say, creating a new perfect research and activist practice, but really forging a form of practice-based research that would allow to experiment and think reflectively on this forensic turn in that we were seeing emerging, and that has continued to emerge within human rights practice. And very briefly, I guess that forensic architecture really takes classical state-led forensic science and kind of pushes it into new directions. It challenges the very limited understanding of violence that is usually investigated in front of court of law, i.e. violence that can be translated into violations, right? And really seeks to investigate expansive forms and modalities of violence that do not always find neat translation into the language of the law. It seeks to expand the forms of traces that can register that violence, and in particular has a specific spatial focus in terms of registering and modeling those traces. And finally, we very much seek to operate within, but also beyond the various courts of law, also within various forms of people tribunals. So really, forensic architecture expands some of the core categories of state-led forensic science: violence, traces, forms of accountability, seeks to push them in new direction, and seeks to use some of the forensic methods developed initially to police populations on behalf of states, and use them instead as tools that can be used by citizens to demand accountability from states and private actors. And what my colleague Lorenzo Pezzani and myself have tried to do since 2011 is bring this perspective to bear on the maritime frontier with the project Forensic Oceanography. And here what we really tried, first of all, to document, but also theorize, is the particular form of violence operating at the maritime frontier, what we call liquid violence, violence that is perpetrated both at and through the sea, in the sense that the majority of the more than 40,000 migrants who have been documented to have died at the EU's maritime frontier since the early 90s, most of them have not died, say, of the bullets of border guards shooting at them, but of a form of mediated and indirect violence that operates through the turning of the maritime space into a hostile environment for migrants. We thought to appropriate some of the sensing tools normally used towards forms of border control to detect acts of unauthorized border crossing. And we sought to use those tools, such as satellite imagery, such as vessel tracking data, use them against the grain to redirect the lights in quotation mark that those tools allow border controllers to shed away from the acts of unauthorized border crossings and towards the violence of the border itself. A shift precisely that we seek to think through the concept of the disobedient gaze that Aisha was mentioning. And we sought to spatialize those traces within the complex political geography of the sea. Now, so this has been a form of research that has enabled us to support various demands for accountability, file legal cases in front of various national and European courts, but also take part in people's tribunals. So it has been a form of militant research to a certain extent, but the term research is really still extremely important here as well, i.e. It has also allowed us, given us a particular angle from which to reflect on the shifting practices, actors, assemblages that make up the border regime operating at the EU's maritime frontier. It's also allowed us to precisely, again, as a practice-based research, reflect on non-governmentality, on the potential, but also the limits and ambivalences of legal politics, and as well on the ambivalences of seeking to uncover the violence of borders, which is always at risk as well of, to a certain extent and at times inadvertently, reproducing the border spectacle, reproducing the racialization of migration, the myth of invasion, upon which the very policies of closure we contest are founded. Forensic architecture, forensic oceanography has offered me over the last couple of years as well, I think, a useful pedagogical lens, if you will. I've been teaching in different contexts a course called Border Forensics, which precisely both introduces students to the way forensic architecture pushes forensic science to its very boundaries and even beyond, but also how this critical forensic practice can be used to document the violence of borders. And my aim is always to kind of bring to the fore various theoretical, methodological, and political questions that allow students to use this perspective far beyond issues of migration and borders in relation to whatever forms of violence are urgent for them, that they are passionate about. Let me just conclude, if I may, with two very brief additional points in relation to some of the questions that were raised. One, in relation to some of the limits I see within the fields of migration, border, refugee studies. I'd like to highlight a point that Aisha made as well in relation to Ranabir's arguments concerning the exceptionalizing of migration and refugees and the disconnect that this introduces in relation to a broad range of other conditions and processes. I think there's really an urgency, if you will, to de-border migration, border and refugee studies, to develop concepts, methodologies that somehow are allowed to cut through these boundaries in knowledge production and connect processes that are often maintained separate within the field and beyond. In my own thinking, the concept of mobility conflicts has been important in the thinking of my colleague Lorenzo Pizzani. The idea of hostile environment has also been important to connect, for example, the way various border zones are turned into hostile environments, the Sahara, the Mediterranean, the Alps, even European cities at present, but also connecting this to forms of environmental destruction related to global warming. The concept of mobility conflict is also really essential for me to go beyond the analysis, the critical analysis of bordering practices, and try to analyze the multi-scalar processes that forge these conflicts along border zones themselves, focusing on migrants' entire trajectories, but also the trajectories of policies themselves. And I think it's really urgent that we somehow transform the very parameters of the problems being addressed in a very binary way today by policymakers and activists, policymakers on the one hand and activists on the other. In a sense, the debate often is kind of reduced to for or against migration, but leaves entirely unaddressed the broader conditions that produce and reproduce the mobility conflicts. And a last issue here connecting to democracy. Some of you may have heard about the recent European Pact for Migration and Asylum Refugees that has been proposed by the European Commission. I've been writing a little bit about this with my colleague Bernd Kasparek, and essentially we argue that the European Pact is not a pact for migration, but actually a pact against migration. It's really a pact forged between European member states to try and resolve their internal crisis of managing migration, a pact between member states against migrants, and really without even considering migrants' voices. And clearly, here we have a tremendous, if you will, democratic deficit that was underlined by Etienne Balibar long ago, i.e., migration policies are by definition non-democratic in the sense that they are policies and laws that are defined by one group of people without consulting the people who are actually concerned and governed by those very policies. And so if the EU, which it wishes in any way to tackle the enduring mobility conflict that opposes the EU's restrictive policies to migrants' movements and desires, the first thing it needs to do is to, as Etienne Balibar called for a number of years ago, democratize borders, allow migrants, refugees, non-governmental actors to take part in the policy and legislative process and include migrants' voices. And I guess that as long as this is not the case, it is really essential that we as researchers seek to bring those voices to the fore. Thank you very much.
Thank you. 3 brilliant presentations. I enjoyed your presentation, Charles, particularly the forensic part of it. And I'll come back to you with the question that the kind of evidences and testimonies that your forensic technologies allow you to scoop out. how can you actually bring that to bear on the existing legal regimes? In other words, I can anticipate that there might be an excess of evidences which don't readily allow themselves to be fitted into the legal regime. So what do you do? How can you resolve this moral dilemma? Because it's an ethical question as well. I will come back to this question a little later, but we have collected a few questions from the floor. And this is one question to all of you, which is this, that, and I'm just paraphrasing the question, which is this, the migration of slave labor. And does it have any resonance in, none of you has touched on this particular aspect, but if you feel like, I mean, in what way, for instance, the question of citizenship remains a question because of the migration that has taken place, let's say 200 years back. So how is this citizenship question to be resolved or addressed? It is a legacy of colonialism. That's what one of the questioners feels. The second question has more to do with classroom practices, because I guess none of you has touched upon classroom practices. It's more or less some kind of research methodology seminar, so to say. I'm reading out the question. This question comes from Samata Biswas, one of our members of CRG, and she teaches in Sanskrit College and University. I'm curious whether refugee and migration studies is something that is only a field of knowledge production, and its pedagogy only associated with research. So you look upon pedagogy as a spin-off of research, rather than pedagogy as a means of knowledge production itself in its own right. What is then taught in the plethora of refugee and migration studies MA courses that exist in Europe? Are the students only taught how to do research? Is there no classroom teaching? Or are the research projects never taught? What about such pedagogic practices? I will request the moderator and the panelists to kindly reflect on it. There is another question which is for Laura. This question comes from Vaishali. Many times during conversations with migrant and refugee populations, the responses from the people of the community is also informed by policy-making bodies or even NGOs that represent the community, or simply those that in a way speak for them, quote, speak for them. I guess Aisha can also reflect on this, because it has to do with how can you make the migrant speak, because it's not the migrant who speaks, it's the migrant who speaks through you. So it's a mediation which actually tarnishes the authenticity claim. How, in your opinion, should a researcher learn to establish the difference? Is this process of listening to voices of refugee populations, how does one be cautious of mixing of agenda-led voices? I think this question comes straight to Laura. This part of the question, because those in many ways also establish the so-called agency of refugee populations. There is another question: how has climate change and natural disasters affect human trafficking world over, particularly in India? Now, I don't think that this is a question which actually has to do with the pedagogy, so you may not answer this question. But if you so desire, you can answer this question. For Charles, I have this question that how can you resolve the ethical dilemma that when you have an excess of data which ask you to become disloyal and disobedient, but on the other hand, as a practitioner, you have to be loyal to the legal regime. So what do you do with this excess? What is the pedagogical future? I mean, you can share this data with your students in the class. They can learn it. because you know that it's not simply the practice, the legal activism that hails, that actually summons this data, but you have other practices as well. So I will come back to each one of you. And if you allow me, I would like to sort of reverse the order. I'll begin with Charles while sort of making your responses.
Okay, thanks a lot. Well, then I'll pick up first of all with your own questions on the excess of data in relation to the law. This is really something that we've encountered constantly, in fact. First of all, because as I tried to highlight before, the form of violence operating at the maritime frontier is predominantly a form of indirect violence, which is very difficult for to account for within the very limited language of the law that is mostly focused on direct violence, on that direct link between a perpetrator and a victim. But so in one case that we investigated, the Left to Die boat case, the crime that is for which states were prosecuted was the crime of non-assistance, right? The failure to avert situations of death at sea by migrants, by vessels in vicinity. But other shifts in policy, such as the ending of the Italian Mare Nostrum operation, a large-scale military and humanitarian operation that lasted from 2013 to 2014. This shift, which actually resulted in a staggering increase in the number of deaths at sea, could actually never be accounted for within the limited language of the law. And believe me, we have brilliant legal expert friends with who we have ongoing conversations. And, you know, legal thinking is in fact a highly creative practice. But despite that, they were not able to translate that form of even more distended, spatially distended violence into a violation in front of the court of law. Another issue that we face is that actually legal activism does not only oppose violent practices, but actually shapes them in turn. This is extremely clear if you think, for example, of the Hirsi judgment in 2012, in which Italy was condemned for breaching its obligation of non-refoulement by bringing back migrants intercepted on the high seas to Libya. Well, very simply, since that judgment hinged on the argument that with migrants on Italian ships, Italy exercised effective control over those migrants and thus jurisdiction, essentially the Hirsi judgment has been used as a kind of blueprint for Italy and the EU's current practice, which is refoulement by proxy using the Libyan Coast Guard without European assets ever touching the bodies of migrants. So again, litigation not only opposes, but also becomes, also shapes new practices of violence. In fact, becomes to a certain extent an architect of border violence itself. And these are some of the ambivalences, of course, that we need to address. So essentially, to my students, when I teach this this course and the research that we've done, I try to enable them and push them to be really attuned to the limits of the language of the law, to these kind of ambivalences, and to try to think as well beyond the language of the law and beyond the forums of the law for other forms of accountability, but also other practices of transformation that operate beyond the demands for accountability.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the question about what do we teach in the classroom, because it brings us back from the issues we've been discussing to explain a bit more about how they are made manifest in the classroom. So I teach on we have a master's degree course called Migration, Mobility, and Development at SOAS. And we've had it for now 11 years. I was one of the architects that set it up in the first place. And I think what we envisioned when we set it up was to have an interdisciplinary consideration of migration and refugee studies that started from its very beginning, from its very first lecture, to question and challenge some of the received kind of conventional ways of understanding migration. So we interrogate and critique policy, we interrogate and critique the structures that have led to migration and displacement taking place, and we absolutely root that within the colonial history of many of the regions in which this takes place, but as well the continuing impact of neocolonial economic structures that widen the gulfs of inequality and render people in need of movement in order to secure their livelihoods or to achieve safety. So those kinds of inequalities behind the conflicts that exist, but as well behind the economic conditions that people are moving away from and towards as well. I mentioned that so as we're involved in a university-wide process of decolonizing the curriculum, which invites all of us who are involved both in teaching and in learning as students to engage in a process of trying to think more explicitly, more deliberately about the kinds of scholarship that we're drawing from, to draw from a wider range of scholarship, to ensure that we're not just pulling from the most famous journals or the most well-known authors, but that we are also seeking other kinds of voices to be part of those discussions. I should say, I think, and it's worth mentioning that this COVID crisis, if there's any silver lining, and there isn't much of a silver lining. I've just this morning news of a dear friend who lost their life to the virus. So I'm feeling it particularly today. But if there is any silver lining to this, it's the fact that we can have these kinds of conversations. So even though I'm in lockdown in London, I can speak to you and in Calcutta, and that should absolutely count for something towards having more of these kinds of dialogues that are so important in the classroom as well as for ourselves. There's huge amount more to say about that. And I'm sorry that we probably should have stuck to that more in our those were our marching orders, so we should have stuck to it perhaps more in our comments. The question was asked of what could I give an example of how to address some of the power asymmetries that I was referring to. One example maybe, and it's not perfect, but it's certainly a significant change from the way things normally are, that I'm involved in quite a large research hub called the Migration, Inequalities and Development Research Hub on South-South migration. It is led by a UK-based principal investigator, Heaven Crawley at the University of Coventry. But the way that this project is structured is such that the huge amount of the budget and the responsibility for designing the research plan is held in the countries, the 12 different research countries in which data is being gathered and analysis is being done. And I lead a thematic work package on poverty and inequalities. I'm really there as a kind of technical support person, that I can answer questions, I can help with design, I can be involved in capacity bridging if that's necessary. But for the most part, I'm not driving the research process. And again, in this particular COVID era that we're living through, that actually has proven to be a very effective way of actually continuing to get research done, even though I'm stuck here. I am absolutely amazed at the amount of research that's being done under really difficult conditions by those who are leading it. Although it's really important as well to keep in mind the risk that they're facing and to ensure that they're not taking unnecessary risks just in the service of the research program. So so the point is that it's a different way of structuring budgets. It's a different way of conceptualizing the whole research enterprise, which in some, as much as one can, given the structures, the way that they currently are, it kind of upends the typical power relations that one might often see. Again, I said it's not entirely perfect, but I think it's a step in the right direction. the final question was around, I just wrote down authoritative voices. Oh yes, how do you navigate authoritative voices? And it's absolutely the case. I think all of us as researchers have had these issues where we, someone speaks really eloquently, seems to be really easy to understand, and therefore you listen to that person more than someone else. And you privilege that perspective. And of course, we know that with that perspective comes a certain version of history, a certain version of understanding of politics, a certain account of how migration took place and what the issues are there. And I think we all have to think about how to check ourselves, to recognize when we are being kind of seduced by the ease of research in that sense, to really challenge ourselves to look for the more difficult kinds of accounts and stories. That's true on an individual basis as a researcher, but I'm also reminded of the Delhi migration conversation that we had, in which colleagues at the Calcutta Migration Research Group also made the very strong point that even if you're working in South Asia or just in India, one must recognize that there are different voices coming from different directions within India. So Delhi, being the seat of government, has a certain perspective and a certain narrative about migration that one will get if you have an event. And we were chastised for holding our event in Delhi and said, why don't we have it in Calcutta, where you'll get a much more critical kind of line of analysis. That was a really valuable perspective to come away from. And I've kept it with me throughout this research process. So it's not just about, at an individual basis, which stakeholder do you talk to, which migrant representative do you talk to, but also where do you locate those conversations, and what kind of people are you talking to within the academic discourse that might be shuttering you from other kinds of perspectives. I think they're really important. I hope I answered all those questions. I know there's Subir asked that question saying, I know my question doesn't really relate to the panel, but could anyone take a stab at it? I can take a quick stab and hopefully others can as well. But I think the question around how does climate change impact trafficking? We know that absolutely trafficking goes on an increase when there is climate change going on, when the more economically destitute people are, the more vulnerable they are to being preyed upon. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done. I have a PhD student right now working in the Philippines trying to understand the relationship between trafficking and Cyclone Haiyan. More research like that, I think, is needed to be done to really tease out those questions. Sorry to go on. I'm finished.
Thanks, Laura. Over to Aisha.
Okay, thank you very much. I will start from the classroom teaching and the kind of the pedagogy, and of course that is very much that I did not talk particularly in terms of the classroom teaching. Of course, it is not necessary. It's not only research in terms of, and it is important. And I will not repeat in terms of the urgency and the importance of the kind of decolonizing and decentering the kind of the courses that we are teaching, but also this is a very complicated one, because actually I will pick up where Laura left in terms of the seeing the different voices that is from Delhi or from different, so that the kind of the pluralities of those kinds of forces. And I think this is one of the importance of that, trying to have a kind of a decentered and decolonized syllabus or curricula. So not simply taking some kind of different regions, a kind of a canonized voice, and then juxtaposition. So, I mean, in terms of in the decentering is that I think it goes not only in terms of the kind of it is about the unsettling the power of the kind of the voices that we include into the curriculum. So even from very different places, or even from where I teach, trying to get kind of different kinds of voices that to juxtapose. These might be different streams of research, different methodologies, but also different from different regions. And I think there, one of the dangers that I see is that in many cases, that with the decolonization that is taken, or a very very straightforward in terms of that, adding different kinds of regions and kind of the canonized voices of that region. So I really find it very important what Laura had emphasized. In terms of the teaching, that is, I think, interestingly, I rarely teach a course on migration or on refugees. Instead, that which I find it very fruitful, is that I teach a course on methodology. I teach a course on anthropology of policy, for example. But there, then I put the kind of find it very useful in terms of putting the emphasis on the issues in relation to address the refugees and then the migrants within that kind of a broader perspective. And within the methodology course, which I found it very useful, is that, for example, the students do a kind of research in the courts, in the asylum seeking application courts, in terms of the refugees in cultural industries, in the theaters, in the art scene, and then trying to unpack these kind of the questions, and then going back to what Charles was saying in terms of the showing the kind of the ambivalences, and that the kind of the unsettling the theoretical and methodological certainties on the basis of that kind of a very concrete case, that I find it very very useful in turn. And there I found it this kind of a kind of the points that I was trying to bring up, how it translates into classroom teaching. There was one a kind of a question about I think the question about one was on slavery, and then the statelessness, and then the question of citizenship, and then the statelessness. And actually, in terms of the slavery, that which I found it very interesting, is that again that opening the going beyond the field and the boundaries of the migration and refugee studies. So if you teach, or if you work, or include issues about Roma in Europe, then you will get into the questions of bonded labor in terms of that kind of formations, finding their reproduction, and the questions of statelessness, getting into in a much more complicated way, but in a striking way. And in terms of the questions of citizenship, I think it is particularly, and the statelessness is very timely also in Europe also, because that we are now in Europe, that the kind of questions about the depriving of citizenship of the people who had acquired citizenship, that is in Britain, or France was threatening in terms of the people who had become citizens, but in terms of the kind of the moralities, in terms of the practices, and in terms of not sharing the supposed virtues of the figure of the citizen that has been projected. So taking I think these are very important and very interesting questions of the fragility of citizenship, which taught to be very much engraved in very solid in European quote unquote democracies. So this. I think these are very interesting questions to look at it together in dialogue, in conversation, what has been going on in Southeast Asia or in South Asia today in terms of the statelessness. I mean, the deprivation of the citizenship, the question with ISIS issues that came very much into play in several places. And here for the kind of the mutual learning and how could we come up with very different questions than remaining within our comfort zones of questions be in Europe, be in Asia, is actually, this is the raison d'etre why we had established this Europe-Asia research platform with Calcutta Research Center and IWM. So this is the whole aim, actually. And there was one question about the can migrants speak, but I didn't hear it acoustically. If you want to repeat, then I could address that.
Let me repeat it for you. The question was that it's only, let's say, an NGO or aid-giving agency that speaks on behalf of the migrants.
Okay.
And so where is the agency here? So it's agency-driven voice that we are listening.
Okay, but this is actually what I was trying to get at it. It is not only the NGOs speaking for the migrants or the refugees, but because of this kind of a field that their subjectivities that I was referring to, that they have been being constituted, that we find it becomes very difficult to find out what kind of mediated voices are being used and made and unmade by the refugees that you are talking to. So it is not necessary. I mean, for example, I could give you a kind of an example in one of the projects that one of the very established theaters in Vienna was doing, and suddenly that several of those art institutions, I have nothing against this kind of using film or art if the person like Charles is being trained for that and that, but now there is a kind of it became a kind of obligatory part of projects. So and increasingly, especially in Europe. So in one of the very established theaters, which had been very close to anyone who was coming from migration background, their doors, but then suddenly had a project with the refugees. So within that project, that is, we were talking to the refugees who were part of those theater pieces. And after a while, that's, I mean, you're hearing some kinds of voices that were made you suspicious of that very, very smooth kind of voices. And then afterwards, actually, what came out was that there was a very strong conflict in terms of the writing the narratives about this. So they had the facilitators to write the narratives for the refugees, which they will themselves act. So that the people wanted to talk about very different things, and they wanted to bring up very different issues, but it became a kind of a very much a navigated voice. At the end of the day, actually, the voice became, the mediated voice became the dominant one, and then the others had to leave afterwards. So this is, and they left. They left the group, and they had the courage to leave the group, and I think that was very important. But this is what I'm talking about in terms of the dilemmas of bringing in terms of those kind of the valorizations, and they are very much embedded in very strong power asymmetries.
Thank you.
I don't know whether that answers your question.
No, it answers the question. I think it brilliantly answers the question. I think I must thank the three panelists. We have slightly overshot the time, but if you allow me 1 minute's time, because it has been a great learning experience for me. And I will raise three questions. There is an agreement amongst all of us that the voices of the migrants, the voices of the refugees are to be listened to, are to be articulated. But I think that there are three almost insurmountable problems. The first is regarding the decibel of the voices being heard. What do you do with the voices? You listen to them, but what do you do? Does your template of practice allow you to make use of those voices? The question which I asked Charles, and he has answered it brilliantly. The second is about the cacophony of voices. I'm deliberately using the term cacophony because you know that it's not simply plurality, but how do you make sense of what you hear? You hear so many things. It does not push us into the other extreme of looking for an authentic voice, because there isn't any, probably, the authentic voice. But I think that we have to learn how we can actually address the question of power asymmetry amongst these different voices and how we can engage with that. The third question, which to my mind is also very important, is what you have said, all three of you, is a very teacher-centric view of pedagogy. Teacher-centric view of pedagogy. So when you go to the class and you lecture, are you mindful of the kind of students that you are teaching? Are they ready to listen to what you say? Because the composition of the students has enormously changed, particularly in Europe. So who all are going to listen to us? So, you know, that doesn't our pedagogic strategy also at some point try to mitigate the students' voices, try to address the students' voices? We don't have time. These are the three questions, maybe for a future webinar. Thank you very much. I learned a lot. It's not simply being modest to you, but that I really mean it. It's a great learning experience for us. And I, on behalf of Calcutta Research Group, thank all of you. Brilliant presentations, brilliant responses. I also thank particularly the participants and the questioners, because we learned a lot by way of hearing those questions. Thank you very much. So, is there
Thanks
any
to you, Samir.
Thank you very much. We thank you.
Thank you so
And
much.
thanks indeed for all the questions. And I'm not sure we were able to do justice to all of them. So we would all love to be able to hang out and chat informally after this event. But hopefully this will be for next year. But if there are questions that you feel remained unanswered, please do feel free to be in touch with us via email.
Wonderful. So I take the opportunity of making an announcement here, particularly to our participants of winter workshops. So if you feel like, you just pass on your questions to our team and Sumika, who heads the desk. So she will be responsible for passing on to the 3 resource persons whom we have met but didn't have time to interact enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Before we go, I would also take the opportunity to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Institute for Human Sciences, Vienna. Without their cooperation, this wouldn't be happening and we would not get to listen to you. So thank you everyone for your presence. Have a pleasant night, evening, day, wherever you are. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all. Bye-bye.
Bye.